asking for the outcomes list that Conrad showed earlier. So I have uploaded a PDF of it to this location. I'll show this again at the end of the session, so for those of you who can't write this stuff down super fast or grab it on your smartphones, I'll come back to that in
So just to say, I mean, one of the things we'd like to achieve here is, you know, if you guys have a chance, I mean, obviously the outcomes thing is a work in progress, very much so. So it'd be great, one of the things that'd be great to do is obviously as I flicked it up, it was hard to get a sense of it. If you guys have a chance to look at it, please do, and you know, we can discuss it more tomorrow and after that. But I think it's a really important thing to be able to tether everything to. Let's get on with this session.
Yes, everything seems a bit big on the screen. Let me bring this down a bit further. So it's the same address, but there's another way of making it. I'll come back to this at the end. So
let's get on with the session.
So this is the session to look at what's in, what's out. And if I can start by setting the scene by saying that our principle, particularly on hand calculating, is very straightforward, that we only teach hand calculating for two reasons. One is it's the most practical way to solve the problem. Times tables might be an example of that. There's no more practical way than that if you're in a shopping queue. Or if the knowledge of the procedure is actually empowering. And that's where all the thorns are, is in that second one. It's deciding whether something is really conceptually empowering or is just a tool of the moment. And so
I think let's zoom out. Let's zoom out one step further. The point of this session, just to be clear, is we need to actually get down to the reality of what are we throwing out of the curriculum in the traditional curriculum, and what do we want to add in? And you know, we've actually got to really discuss those things and get down to it. And what are the criteria by which we're figuring that out? So I think Jon has just gone into essentially some of the criteria for figuring that out. And
these are the questions I ask myself when we have these debates, at least. So what we want to do with this session is actually pick some specific things and hear comments, maybe some of my view, some of your view about whether or not they meet some of this criteria or have some other reason why they should be in a maths curriculum or should not be in a maths curriculum. So we take some of these from the floor. I prepared a list to start us off, so maybe I should just we should pick one up out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the right way to do this, or an interesting way to do this, is to just pick some pseudo-random examples, so to speak, and discuss them. You know, do we agree that they're in? Do we agree that they should be? Or, I mean, you know, to what extent should they be in? Should they be out? Why? You know, how are we figuring that out? So let's take that. Okay, the quadratic formula.
There's no particular order to this, but that would be a good one to start.
Right. So what we mean is whatever it is. Can I still remember the quadratic formula? It's probably not a good start to this one. Minus b plus or minus the square root. Right. I mean, to me, okay, so let's you know, people usually learn this pretty much around the world, I think, in math curricula at some level. Is anyone, I mean, do you believe, you know, instinctively this is something that should remain in the curriculum or should be out of the curriculum?
I say in, but not nearly as much time.
Okay.
Build intuition about what formulas are. And it's just complex enough to tell you that more is happening than you might have thought.
Okay.
But it's not so complex that you kill yourself on it. But we today spend way too much time on that kind of thing. So something very close to that, or that exactly, for a while, but not as long as now.
But so what you're really saying is, what you want to see is the ability to be able to manipulate something of that complexity. Whether it happens to be that or something else is probably not the main point. It's a thing to do with the manipulation of that complexity. Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Christian had a point. We've got some others as well.
Yeah, hi. I think that it will be perfect job for high school students to derive it or to invent the formula. I think it's exactly in their level to invent the formula, to make it happen in high school.
Okay.
I think it represents an opportunity to do something else, which is to say, does a parabola contact the zero axis? Or if it does, the distance between those 2 points is twice the square root of whatever.
So look, I'm going to apply my two tests. Okay. Test.
Before you do that, is there anyone who wants to disagree? There seems to be some support for keeping it. Is there anyone on the anti-side who wants to speak up?
Brian here.
Very much agree with the sentiment with something of that complexity.
Okay. Let's take one more on this particular one so that we get to further, and then let's apply.
I'd like to say it's the first and only example at an elementary level where a problem has multiple solutions.
Okay, it's an interesting perspective.
Okay, I'm going to express a neutral point of view since nobody has. So I don't particularly care one way or the other if you keep it down. But I wanted to point out that someone who is not, first of all, we teach the multiplication table, and that's equally boring and also equally easy or difficult, depending on how you prefer to look at it. So I wanted to point out, I mean, someone who is not able to handle that level is not going to go very far.
Yeah. So okay. I think I've got that one. Okay. So let's apply what at least I consider are two of the key issues here. One is, do you use it in the real world? Okay. So question one is, do you actually use the quadratic formula in its own right in the real world? I think the answer to that is no. Does anyone use that thing in the real world other than in education? I've never actually met anybody who really uses it. So it fails that. Second question, in my view, which is key, is does it conceptually empower you in some way that, that not having it doesn't achieve? Again, I think a lot of people have said there is some conceptual empowerment connected with knowing how to deal with things of that complexity, but it's not clear to me it is the right thing to pick. It's like there are 100 other things you could pick that would do that job probably better. So it doesn't seem to me like that's the key thing to have. Now, on the other hand, setting up the problem, I wouldn't count as, I think that's a separate issue from the actual formula.
So I have an observation about most of the comments we got, which were there were valid reasons, but they could apply to all kinds of other examples. So the question is that the best way to introduce something like multiple solutions where, pendulums, could you do that in a physical way? Is it the best way to introduce a simple formula where maybe there are other formulas that would be simple?
I think we should move on to some other ones to discuss if we can, because that will sort of open up the things. You go on.
Okay.
You wrote the list, not me.
Okay. Let's go for. We'll start with the long division like we did last time. Let's go for edge detection. This is something that obviously isn't in the curriculum at the moment. So things like image processing are obviously math.
Using wavelets that we heard a little bit about in the last session, right? David has a point.
So all of these questions are framing the problem, which is, do we teach tools or do we teach carpentry? So I think, let's not focus on, we've got a long list of tools, which is interesting, but they're all just tools. What about we thought about what does carpentry look like in mathematics, and how does computer-based math help people to learn carpentry rather than the hammer, the nail, the board, etc.?
Well, actually, that's partly my fault that this list is like that, because I think what John and I were discussing yesterday, it's like, is it easier to pick on very specific examples to try and make the point, or should we look at the concept? I completely agree that the issue isn't really edge detection. The issue is, where does image processing fit, and is that a useful concept in the curriculum as well as the actual detailed tools? And that, by the way, is back to our outcomes tree, because I think what you're pointing out is that what we've listed here, now I look at it, is a bunch of things in our math tools section of our outcome tree rather than some of these bigger picture things.
Yeah. So I want to support this and actually take it a step further. That I think the issue of, if we're really talking about a revolution of the curriculum, we shouldn't be looking at individual components. We should actually be thinking about the curriculum as a whole. And we were discussing earlier that, the current curriculum is held together with calculating. For better or worse, it holds the current curriculum together very well. What will hold together a new curriculum? If we say calculating needs to be taken out, how do we build a consistent curriculum which takes students from very early primary school right the way through to a PhD, and what's going to hold it all together? That, to me, is the more interesting question. And when you're actually thinking about a new curriculum really radically, these questions are irrelevant. And it's somehow the same problem we had with this same topic last year, that we're asking the wrong questions when we're looking at these specifics.
No, but here's where I disagree about that, because I think you're right that you need to have tethering points, but then you actually need to have specifics of those tethering points. So one of the problems we've had, take the Estonian example, take other examples, you know, this list of outcomes, which, you know, is an important set of tethers. Now, you're right that this particular list is perhaps one of the subtrees of one of the dimensions of outcome. But in the end, I think it's a tethering to outcomes that is going to hold the thing together. And the problem at the moment is, you know, frankly, when we've looked at many of the outcomes that are out there, they are too high level. You know, we want critical thinking. Well, completely agree, but what do you do with that? What does that tell you about whether the quadratic formula is in the thing or not? Right? And at the other extreme, it's like, we want people to know the quadratic formula. And then you say, why? And they say, well, because it's good for you in various ways. I mean, I'm being a bit naughty here, but basically, there are a set of things you go through, and in the end, it's like, we can't really tell you why you want it. It's just because we've done it before, it's sort of hard to justify. So, to me, you need something in between those levels as tethering points that one can really, in a sense, you know, you can test stuff against. That's kind of thing.
But that's exactly my point. My point is that those tethering points have to form a flow. So if you're saying the Estonian example, the example you've got there is statistics. So if you're saying the heart of it should be statistics, then you've got a flow on which to build your whole curriculum. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm saying that's what needs more thought. What is that flow going to come from?
I think...
And so if you're going to use statistics, why not look at the examples? So Estonia is sort of following the example which New Zealand's already done. So New Zealand has done this for their curriculum a few years ago in a very different way. And so they've learned a lot for statistics. But if we're looking at the maths curriculum as a whole, we have to look at how we build it up again. So I think there is a bigger issue which really does relate to what's at the heart.
So we make these things out as individual examples, but perhaps one way of looking at this list is to read this from the bottom up as being things like image processing or graph theory in the middle and at high-level things. But we felt that
we had a point back.
Actually, we have one here as well. So perhaps at the back first, and then we'll come to the front.
Just to respond to what David just said. So I develop math curriculum and spend a lot of time on the kind of real-world side, but I'll play kind of the contrarian to our own approach. I mean, David, I think where mathematics is different than carpentry is carpentry isn't an object of inquiry in and of itself. And so, you know, mathematics in the sense that like there's problem solving, looking at math, understanding mathematics for mathematics' sake is actually very valuable. And maybe, you know, looking at nail placement isn't. But the... Was it not clear what I...
There's no way that anyone would agree with that. Carpentry is a pursuit of great beauty all by itself, and it motivated inquiry for thousands of years.
No, but...
There's absolutely no obvious truth in what you said.
so
Move on.
all right. So the point I'm making is that mathematics, we explore mathematics oftentimes where there is no practical application of it, and that's good. You might disagree whether that's good or not. But one thing I would sort of push back on a little bit is if we're looking at this strictly through the prism of kind of practical applications, then it seems like we're aligning ourselves very much on kind of one side of the math war, which there's then a risk that the pendulum kind of swings otherwise the other way very quickly. I wonder whether there's sort of a political sensibility in terms of like keeping some things in that may not kind of, you know, fit that, but just for the sake of kind of protecting the flame.
You know, I mean, yes, there are pragmatic things you have to do, but I think one of the key points here is you've got to keep the vision. Now, you may have to make compromises to the vision along the way, for sure. But in the end, one of the mistakes I think has been made quite a few times in trying to do things with math reform is people are so concerned, and I understand why this is, but they're so concerned about the next semester that the vision kind of got lost. And so I'm tending to come in from the other direction and say, you know what, if the thing doesn't make sense, and you know, and there may be arguments as we're having here about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, that's fine, that's valid. But in the end, if it really doesn't seem to make sense to most people, and there's not good logic for why it should be there, let's not try and promote it there. Let's instead do the more proactive thing of saying, actually, take image processing, take a lot of the data science areas, which seem to me to be wholly missing right now from much of the curriculum, and are absolutely vital and are conceptually empowering and are also practical in many senses. And to me, you know, the things that are math for its own beauty, I kind of think that people often who are excited by that, if they're exposed to this other kind of math, will find those things, and they should be encouraged in that. I'm worried about pushing those as what everyone needs to learn for the sake of learning it, because I think you start going down this track of we can't really justify it, but we're going to put it in anyway. So that's my perspective. Let's get some
one in the front
others
row here, please.
Yeah.
Thanks. Is this on? Yes. I just want to respond to the speaker over there who's saying we need things that tether the math curriculum, what we do if we use this, and say that mathematics is a broad conceptual subject. It's not a subject that should be looked at as a list of methods. And there are a few big ideas in mathematics that are very important. I showed an audience in England a while back the elementary math curriculum in England, which was made up of about 50 different methods that students had to learn from the ages of 5 to 7. So like 4 big ideas in elementary mathematics. When we move into algebra, there are 3 big ideas in algebra around functional growth, but the curriculum is organized around methods. You should never start teaching algebra with solving for x. That's completely opposite.
Yeah.
Really interesting to do. So that's how you organize the math curriculum. You look at the big ideas that are important for the world, that are important to that. We don't need to tether it around lists of methods.
Yeah, I agree about that. Let's take a couple more, and then I want to come on to suggestions. And also, if there are any, I'd really like suggestions of things that people, whether methods or not methods or bigger conceptual ideas, really think should be in that are not in, and vice versa. So let's take a couple more of comments first. Uh-huh.
For reasons I don't know that anybody ever decided. It looks like the math curriculum that's being taught now is a long march towards calculus.
Well, and even yeah, it depends how you define calculus, by the way.
It depends on how you define calculus.
Yeah.
But the quadratic formula, trig formula,
Yeah.
all of that's a move towards calculus. And my scientist friends don't use calculus more than 5% of what their parents get.
Yeah.
And, so if you're really looking for something that's tethering, and if you like the long march of calculus, the new long march should be towards statistics and computation.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So that's a very useful thing. Just want to add one thing about calculus, though. I think the underlying idea of calculus, talking differential calculus, any of calculus, you're chopping integral calculus. Is what I meant. You're chopping things in little pieces, and there's a way of doing that. That's a system in a sense of being able to evaluate things. I think that basic idea is actually pretty powerful and useful, and a useful part of problem solving. And I think it's amenable to a much younger age range. What gets muddled up is the computational details of doing that. Whether you can do this integral or that integral, which has very little to do with that ability, particularly now those can be done well on computers.
I have to say, I don't think that there is a replacement for that new summit. That I would like to see something where there are multiple mountains to climb, and sometimes you get to the peak, and maybe the peak is statistics, and then you come down and start again and say, let's climb a new mountain.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying it does appear that there wasn't peak before, and if there wasn't peak before, maybe the system likes it.
Okay.
Christian. Could you put the slide back
sorry.
up about your
Take mine.
standards and how you...
Yeah, I would like to stop it for a minute because I think we already were inventing the curriculum, us together, Conrad as well, Jon as well, and I think I kind of summed it up in my slide that we cannot start thinking about these particular problems. And I will totally agree there, I don't remember who it was, that we have to start from the overall idea, from the problems, and from the real life, and then the things kind of pop out themselves.
Although, let me point out, though, Christian, as we were doing that, we were concerned in the end to loop back and figure out, did we cover various things that we wanted to cover? Now, they weren't necessarily tools, right? They were mostly conceptual things, areas of probability and statistics that we thought were important, which I think was probably a better list. But we did worry about it. Now, there was an antithesis to that problem, which was interesting. There were a bunch of areas we were supposed to be covering where we couldn't figure out any problems that we thought would use those areas of maths. Right, so then we immediately thought, well, hang on just a moment. If we can't really figure out how to use these things, maybe that's telling us something, right? Maybe there's a problem in those being a big piece of what we're supposed to be understanding. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to challenge your first point. I think Christopher showed us what happens when you give a kid a problem that he's interested in. He'll work it and he'll figure out whatever he needs. That's what we need. We don't need a national curriculum.
Well,
a national curriculum, I think, is politically charged because people are going to argue about it forever. What we need to keep it focused what the kid is. The kid is the one who's going to learn. He's not going to learn very well unless he's motivated and he likes the problem. If he has that, you can start developing all kinds of other aspects of it as he looks into it. If he solves 10 problems and he finds out that each time that he's got 2 solutions, well, then he might want to look at the quadratic equation, or he might want to just do it on his own. But we should be tailoring our activities to the kid, not trying to force the kid into some standard curriculum that is uniform for everybody, because it isn't going to work.
fair enough.
Okay, so next question's over here on the right.
It's funny, he actually just took the words right out of my mouth. I think with regards to curriculum design, we're talking about here, we think, trying to determine what we want students to know, but no one's really asking what do students want to learn. I think a curriculum that could be effective would be one that's as adaptive as we want our students to be.
I'm just going to moderately disagree, okay, for 1 second. Fundamentally, I agree with what you're saying, and certainly, absolutely, the adaptivity. The only thing that always bothers me with this is in my village in England lives a lute maker, who makes the stringed instruments. And he said to me, so how much do you have to push somebody to try to learn something if they don't know whether they want to learn it? And he was thinking particularly of music. And so there's an issue, I think, that you've got to expose children enough to things that they might not have been in an experience, that they don't know whether they want or are interested in or not. But you don't then want to, force them through it for the next 10 years, whether or not they give a damn. Okay, so I think there's some sort of balance there, where if you just say, well, you figure out what it is you're interested in, it's kind of hard to know what you're interested in if you've never had any exposure to that at all. So I think there's some level of that, and there's some level of what we societally believe it's kind of important for people to know, like about statistics, for example, in the modern world, because they're going to be exposed to it. And if they're not, so there's some sort of level of that, but I don't quite know how to mesh that with the adaptivity and clearly the individuality that we also want.
Well, the problem with that is fundamentally there are numerous problems in the real world. The job is to find the ones in the real world that the kid is interested in. I don't care if it's part of making a game or solving a problem.
Right, but you somehow want to map out a reasonable level of space with those problems, or help to do that. Right, but that's... Of course. Right, but I think the point here is you've got to, then you want those tethering points to help the teacher and the student together to do that. Let's take, I think Christopher had a point over there.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that one of the things is also the fact that, so at some level, all of these things on this list are sort of algorithms. And it's sort of, at some level, or at least in my experience, it's been more useful to know what algorithm does what than how any of them work. So often, for example, I'll know, oh, there's this algorithm that's called a k-dimensional tree, which is used for, nearest neighbor searching or something. And for, I might know that this is a thing, and then, I'll not use it for a long time. And then if I ever need to do nearest neighbor searching, I'll pull it up, I'll look it up, I'll find out how it works, and then I'll implement it. But at some level, it's more important to know sort of what does what and what you need to be using as opposed to exactly how you're going to do it, because the thing is often...
Yeah, so I completely agree. I mean, so one of the issues when we made the outcome thing is there's a difference between knowing something exists, right? Knowing that there is something that, could help you, like wavelets, for example, and knowing necessarily, and there's another level of, well, you actually know how to use that in a coding situation. There's another level of, well, I actually would know how to build a wavelets algorithm, and there's another, there's several levels. And I think one of the things that we've been trying to understand is, outcomes, if you look at our outcomes tree, we've started to map out sort of different levels across, it's kind of a big matrix of levels across those different concepts and across the tools. And you want different levels at different tools for different kinds of applications. And I think that's a great point.
So over on the right-hand side, first of all. Yep.
I think when we take a list like this, arbitrary list, we're trying to inductively figure out what should and should not be in a curriculum. And even if we in this room were able to all agree on that,
tells us is that what we should be focusing on is less on the topics and more on the modalities. We look at, for instance, the Common Core in the United States with the mathematical practices, and we think about, okay, for instance, the quadratic formula. Whether or not we feel it should be in the curriculum, if it's in there, how should we teach it? Maybe we should have our students come up with algorithms to derive it, and then from then on, once they've done that, they no longer have to use it ever again other than the algorithm that they themselves have created. Right? Or if they can develop algorithms for these things that we feel are valuable in the curriculum, then we don't have to do that repetition of calculation because they've already shown that they're able to do that.
So I think one of the problems with all of this ideal is the pragmatism of, is the teacher base capable of running lessons where the student picks their own interesting topic and explores in an open way. And I'm more of the pragmatist in the group, I think that is just too much to ask of the people out there.
With that. What I think is important is we get students to problem solve and critically think in whatever curriculum already exists. And because that's a more
So I agree and I disagree. So here's where I agree. That may well be a good step towards the vision, as long as we keep the vision in mind. And the vision, in my view, is let's, for goodness sake, get rid of stuff we really don't need and has no particular consequence. Now, there are, in fact, I think one of the points about, I have only just realized what we're talking about this is, there are a large multiplicity of things to replace that with. Right? There's a bunch of crud in there that, in my view, at least, we don't need, but there are actually many options as to what to, and you don't need to necessarily fix on one or other of those options. I think there's certain things you do want. For example, I do think it's important that people know a fair amount about analyzing risk. Right? That's something they have to face every day of their lives in different ways. And if people don't have some understanding, it doesn't matter, there are many problem sets and ways they might get to that. But at some point, people need to have some way of assessing risk. And it's kind of bad, I think, if they end up through their education without really being able to do that, as they do at the moment. So I think, I'm not claiming I know how to piece all these bits together, but I think there is a certain amount of that. And in order to make time for that, you've got to get rid of the stuff that really they don't need to be doing. And even if you can sugarcoat that stuff, in the end, it's kind of got to go, although you may have to sugarcoat it in the intervening period to help. That's
so if
yeah. So maybe. Yeah, okay. To me, one of the key things, and it's been said in multiple different ways this afternoon, is you've got to have their context somehow connected. Right? That's a key way. I mean, it may be their context, that doesn't necessarily mean their culture, it may mean their particular individual context. But somehow, things are much more interesting, usually, to people in context.
So we do have other sessions to do today, so I think we have to wrap up there. Thank you very much,
Thanks.
and I will hand over to Mike, who's chairing the next session.